All right, guys, Arch Linux compile kernel. So we're going to show you how to compile a kernel for Arch Linux. Then this is going to give you the latest and greatest kernel. So let's check the version we're on right now just to start. uname-r. So we're on kernel version 6.13.5. Now, first thing we want to do before we build the kernel is we are going to run sudo pacman and just install some prerequisites here, like some base development tools and some other minor tools that we're probably going to need, including git. So let's install these to start. And there you go. So it looks like we had all of these tools were already installed. If you didn't have them already installed, this is the command you would use to install them. Now, remember, check the link in the description if you want to be able to copy and paste these same commands that I have. So yeah, just check the link in the description for my notes. Now, next thing you would want to do, first, there are two different ways that I'm going to show you how to get the kernel. So first, I'm going to show you how you can pull down a specific version of the kernel. The version I'm going to specify is an older version, which doesn't matter because it's not what we're really going to get. But you can run a wget, and in this case, pull down version 6.7. So we can do a wget, pull that down. And now that we have that, so that is going to be in our current directory right here, a compressed file. So we're going to go ahead and uncompress that. Now, once we've got that uncompressed, that's going to give us a directory, linux.6.7 or linux-6.7. So uncompressed it to here, and we would cd into that directory, and from here generate our config and actually build the kernel. But we're not going to do that. So let's jump back out of that directory and remove all of that. So we're going to wipe out all that stuff. That was a specific kernel version. So that's how you'd pull down a specific version you might want to build for whatever reason. But what we really want to show you how to do is how to pull down the latest and greatest from GitHub. So we are going to paste this in here, and see right here, this refers to the GitHub repo for the latest version of the Linux kernel. Let's pull that down. Let's just clone that. All right, so now that we've got that cloned, we are going to go ahead and just cd into the directory. But first, we're going to take a look at, because the directory is just named Linux, so no version listed on that. And let's just check the size real quick. So you can see it's almost 2 gigs. It's 1.9 gigs of source code there. Let's cd into the directory. And these are all the files. So notice no config file here. There's a kconfig, but yeah, there's no regular config file in here, but we are going to go ahead and generate one. So before we do that, real quick, let's check the version. Now, one thing you can do if you have a tagged version of the source code, you could say git describe tags like this. This is not going to work because there's no tags here. So no names found, can't describe anything. But that's one way you could check the version of this, because remember, first thing we tried, we pulled down a specific versioned compressed archive with the version number of the kernel, and now we just pulled the latest and greatest. We just cloned the repo, so it still is important to know what kernel version we have. So we can check that by running by checking the makefile. We can run cat makefile grep-e, grep for the version, the patch level, and the sub level. So let's run that, and you can see version is 6, patch level is 14, sub level is 0. So that's a 6.14.0. Now let's compare that to what we currently have. So currently we have 6.13.5. So we're gonna increase our patch level up by 1, so from a 13 to a 14. So this is going to give us a slightly newer kernel. So we already had a pretty recent version. This is going to give us a slightly newer version. Important to know what version you're going to have. Any case, so let's move along here. Now, one of the biggest things when generating a kernel is to create the config file. This is the actual tricky part. This is the important part of compiling the kernel. So this is the part that's going to actually take some thought. So there are a bunch of different ways to do this. Again, check the link in the description for some alternate ways. I'm going to have some things saved in my notes there, so check that. So I have some alternate ways to do this and some, quick description of each one. But I actually like to combine two methods. A lot of people commonly do this. So one thing you can do is say make, this will generate a config, make old def config. And what this will do is use your old config, but it applies default values for any new options introduced into the newer kernel version. So it's going to take your current configuration for your current kernel, it's going to copy that, and then any new options, any new values that are introduced in your brand new kernel, it's just going to use the default values for that. So if you didn't have any preference, it just goes with the default. So that makes a lot of sense. So if you all you wanted was the latest and greatest kernel and with the same settings as your current kernel, this would be the way to do it. Just run make old def config, and that will generate a valid config for your system, and you can just stick with that and use that. So we're going to generate this here. Should go pretty quickly. Almost there. Any second, there we go. So configuration written to .config. So let's see here. Check this, and you see the config file here. So this is the config, and that's a valid config. We could stick with that if we don't specifically want to make any changes to the kernel. Just stick with that. If you're just building a new kernel and you don't want to make any custom configs, just stick with this. But if you want to customize it, there are multiple different ways you could customize it. One way is to use a menu-driven tool. You can say make menu config. Now you could, instead of running that make old def config, you could just run make menu config and do a fully customized everything based on something you select yourself. But if you want to, what this does is running both of these commands will generate a base configuration based upon your current config, and then allow you to customize that config rather than starting with the absolute bare minimum default and customizing that. So that's why we ran one command to give us just a starting point, which is what we already currently have working, and then customize that rather than just customize the default kernel, right? So anyways, yeah, first do the make old def config and then do make menu config, right? Running make menu config lets us further customize the kernel. So it's going to run a few things and drop us into this tool, and there we go. Here's the tool. Now, I'm not going to do a whole lot here. I'm really only doing this just to show you how you would build a kernel and how you might configure it. So what we're going to do is, let's just jump right in here to, say, power management, and let's see, what do we, what's a good example? Processor type and features. Let's just add support X2 API-C. Hopefully this is a good example. So some things change when I add that, but yeah, let's just enable this one option, and we're going to go ahead and save it. And let's go ahead and exit out of here and exit on out. So now let's just check what's in the directory. Now notice this is the old configuration that we just generated with make old def config. And this is the newer config that we just generated with make menu config. Now let's just diff them just so we can see. So let's run a diff between .config.old and just .config. What has changed? So you see, this is the setting that we changed. So instead of having this commented out, config x86 x2 API-C, it is uncommented and set to yes. So that was changed, and that also looks like it allowed these other options to be added but not enabled. So once you enable this, it adds these as valid options that you could have, but they're disabled by default, I guess. So these really, this is what we changed, this variable here, and these are just they're added as a side effect of what we changed. So that's the diff between the current config and the old config. Now let's go ahead and actually build it. So we're going to run make, and all you really have to do is run make, but we're going to use the -J option to specify how many core or how many parallel processes are going to run at the same time on your system. So let's Control-C this real quick before we run it and say nproc So nproc will give us the number of cores. I only assigned a single core to the system, so that doesn't really matter. We're just going to be running one in parallel. But if we happen to have like 4 cores or 8 cores or however many cores, nproc will list the number of cores, so you can run a make-j, and this will automatically grab the number of cores you have in order to allow you to run that many processes in parallel when building the kernel, which will result in it building a whole lot faster. So this is the part where you actually compile the kernel. Just make, all you have to do is run make, or you can run make-j in the processes. So let's run it. You can just blindly copy and paste this make-j nproc command, and it should work pretty well on your system. All right, so there we go. The kernel has compiled. That took a little while. I sped it up a bit. All right, so also, before I forget, I should mention that this took a little less than an hour between, to actually compile the kernel. So it finished at about 2 o'clock, I would say, and I started it, the time I created that second config file was around 1:03 or something like that. And so I started a little bit after that. So it was, one way or another, it was less than an hour. And this is on a single core virtual CPU running on a system. I believe it has an i5, an old i5. This is, I don't know, it's probably like 10 years old or something. It's a pretty old Intel i5 processor. And yeah, this is running Proxmox. So this is a virtual CPU on that, and it only has 1 core. So that's the performance I got. Less than an hour to compile it, but I sped that part up. So now that we've compiled the kernel, we are going to run make modules install. And we're going to actually go ahead and do that with sudo. There we go. And next, we're going to do sudo make install. Install boot, cannot find Lilo, so that's probably okay. Now, you see here, this is the kernel that we have installed. This is the kernel we compiled and installed. And this was this is the existing running kernel, vmlinux-linux, and vmlinux right here. This is the one that we compiled. And we also created a system map, and it looks like we've created the initramfs-linux image. So once we've got this, we are going to go ahead and actually let's take a look with an A. And okay, so this is what's in this directory, in the boot directory. So let's go ahead and manually create the initramfs. Whether this would work or not without it. And once we have that done, we are going to run sudo dkms auto install. Now, I don't even have the dkms tool in here, and I don't have any dkms kernel modules, so this really won't do anything. You can skip this if this is the case for you, but if you do happen to have dkms modules, this is what you would do. You would run sudo dkms auto install. So nothing there, so don't worry about that. Now, next thing we're going to do is update grub. So we're going to run sudo grub-mkconfig-o and the grub config file right here. And I believe you can also just run update grub. But in any case, we're going to run this to update grub. And that should be fine right there. So found Linux image. So we've updated our grub config right here. and it does not look like this worked. So looks like it's not picking up our kernel due to naming, and I believe it actually, when you generate a grub configuration file, it looks for something named VM lineage dash. And side note, reason it has the Z there, I believe that just indicates that it's a compiled kernel. So VM lineage with a Z at the end, it's a compiled kernel. In any case, it looks for kernels with a VM lineage dash, and it will take all those kernels it finds in the boot directory and create an entry in your grub menu for those. And whichever one came first on the list, it's going to make that the default. So what we are going to want to go ahead and do here is we're going to rename this. So sudo, let's see, uname -r. So we are on 13. So we are going to move sudo mv VM lineage to VM lineage dash 6.14.0. So a version, we're going to name it with the version in the name. So there we go. This is our current kernel that we're using, and this is the new kernel. So let's try regenerating that config again. Now we could just create the grub config manually, but I'd like to avoid that if I can. So we're going to go ahead and just say sudo grub mkconfig -o and the config file location. So found Linux image and init.rd image. All right, so there we go. We've regenerated this. Now let's take a look. Let's just take a quick look at our grub config now, even though this is a large and overly complicated config file. Now, just jump down here to where we actually have boot entries. Let's see. So first one, this is going to be booting. Yeah, so the default is still the kernel that we had before. But we have additional options to, boot that one again with different options. And with a fallback image. And right here, this is the entry for the new kernel that we just generated right here. So you'd have to manually select this with grub if you want the new kernel. That's so that's kind of suboptimal, but there you go. Now you could rename the files and regenerate again to try to control the order, or you could just manually create this grub config file and then have full control over the order in which they boot and which one is default. So what I'm going to go ahead and do, and this is going to break updates. So those are your options. You can also change which one is the default. So you can go ahead and you can edit your config file. Let's try this. vi etc default grub, and actually I'm going to sudo this. And we're going to change grub default to 2. So the second kernel found, it should make that the default. And we are going to, there are a few other things in here I'd like to change too. All right, grub disable submenu. So let's go ahead and disable that so we have a simpler menu layout in our config file. So let's write and quit. So this file just defines some variables that define how your grub config is generated. So now that we've changed that, let's go ahead and regenerate this again. So sudo grub-mk config. Yeah, so this is probably one of the least deterministic parts of building a custom kernel. So let's just generate that one more time. And now let's just view the file just to see what happened. So let's vi our actual grub config, jump to the beginning, and let's just move on down to our actual kernel entry. So here we go. Our first menu entry is this entry right here, and still not pointing to the kernel that we want. So vmlin is Linux. I'm gonna remove this just for the moment, and let's try generating this one more time. Oops. So our first menu entry is going to be our old kernel, and our second menu entry is the new kernel. So there you go. Old kernel, new kernel, and no fallback. So let's see if we can adjust this a little bit more. So grub default 1. We had it on 0. We already had it on 0. Let's try this. Again, real quick. Jump to the beginning and move on down to our first menu entry. Yeah, no luck. Let's just change this number one more time before I just wipe out the old kernel. Number 2. Let's generate this one more time. Jump to the top. And yeah, it just doesn't seem to want to give us the entry we want. So I'm going to go ahead and just rename this. I don't want to just go ahead and delete the kernel. I'd like to keep it around. So I'm going to go ahead and move I probably should have done this anyways, just so you can tell what it is. Let's see. This is going to be, you know what? Let's check this. Rename-r. So we're on 6.13.5. So we're going to say sudo mv vm. This is probably the right way to do this anyways. We're going to vmlin is Linux, and we're going to move this to vmlin is, and let's just call this 6.13.5. Now let's generate our config file again. So found image 14 and 13. Now let's finally check our actual grub config file. Let's jump up to the top again and scroll down until we get to our menu entry. here we go. First menu entry by default is, there you go. There is our kernel that we compiled right there. So first menu entry, first default menu entry is going to load. Yeah, it's going to go ahead and just load the newly built kernel 6.14.0. And the second menu entry is going to load the old kernel 6.13.5. So that's exactly what we want. Spent too much time poking around with that, and I was probably doing something obviously wrong. That should have been a little bit easier, but in case, if you spotted something I did wrong, leave a comment down below letting me know. Maybe I missed something, but in any case, yes, we have basically done almost everything. We've generated our grub config. Let's reboot the system. I'm going to go sudo reboot. Lost our SSH connection to the server. And we're just going to wait a minute, and we are going to SSH back into this in just a sec. All right, so there we go. Looks like it's back. So we can log into our server, and let's check uname-r. There we go. So we are on version 6.14.0, and it gives us, RC5 and this nice little number right here. So yeah, release candidate 5, something, something, whatever. All right, yeah, so there we go. There's our brand new kernel that we just booted, version 6.14.0. And let's see, boot. We have our old kernel version we could switch back to if we want, and our new kernel version. Now, I'm not sure how if I were to update the kernel version, one last thing. So this is basically everything I wanted to show you in this video. So that basically concludes our video, but there's one more thing I want to show you just out of curiosity. Maybe someone will find this interesting. What if I were to upgrade the kernel using Pacman after having done a custom kernel configuration? So what if we were to do sudo pacman Linux headers? With this should see that the package is already installed, but reinstall it, and I'll bet you that adds another kernel entry. It places another kernel in there. It will look like the kernel is missing. Let's give it a shot and see what happens. Should be relatively quick. So it says the kernel is up to date, reinstalling. So I'm going to go ahead and proceed with that. So remember, kernel 6.13.5, it's trying to reinstall that. And by default, it should be named vmlinux-linux in Arch Linux, based on what the package that Pacman installs names it as. So let's see how that works. All right, so there we go. We've installed that. Now let's just check real quick what's in our boot directory. All right, there we go. You'll notice we have vmlinux right here in our boot directory, and we have the old kernel and the new kernel we just compiled. So this was just installed by Pacman right now, and this is the exact same kernel as this old one that we were running. So we reinstalled it, and let's just check. I'm going to go ahead and check the grub config here just to see what those menus look like. Jump up to the top here and jump on down. So this should have been updated by Pacman as well, or by the package. So this first entry here is pointing to our new kernel. It hasn't been messed up. And then the old kernel. And the Pacman installed version didn't update anything. Maybe since it's reinstalling the same kernel, it thought that it did not need to. The package is there, so it didn't need to update grub, and it was mistaken. So us messing around with grub with the custom entries was not detected by Pacman, apparently. So what if we manually update grub again? Let's just do that just to see what happens. So it looks like it found 3 kernel images, the one we just installed, which is the same as this one that it found and the new one. So it looks like it found this one first, VM Linux-Linux, so that will make it the default boot option is going to be the one that Pac-Man just installed. So, and purely based on the naming. So if we go down here, menu entry, this first one right here, VM Linux-Linux, that's what Pac-Man installed. So when we manually update grub, it will update it to include all the kernels in order and pick that one first. Then after that, you see we have the fallback, using the fallback image, that same Linux. And then scrolling down even further, we finally have our new kernel that we built. And then further than that, we have our old kernel, which is what we renamed. So there you go. They're all there, and you could boot any one of them if you want to wait during the boot process and stop it and select whatever you want from the grub menu. If not, you'd have to rename or remove some of those. Now, let's jump into the boot directory and MD5 sum. Do I even have this tool on the system? Let's see. VM Lin is... Now, interesting thing. Okay, so there we go. You can see that VM Linux that was just installed by Pac-Man and the old one that we renamed, they have the exact same checksum. So this and this, same checksum. So those are literally the exact same data in both of those files. So it's when I renamed this to this, Pac-Man sees that it's missing and reinstalls it here. But it didn't update grub for us, so when we manually updated grub, it then added all three of these entries into the grub config. Just it made this one the default. Now, what happens when you when you install something? When you run when you update grub using the tool, what it does is it takes a bunch of templates and scripts that dictate how that config is generated, and it takes some of your own custom configurations that you put in that one file that we edited briefly under etc default grub. It takes some of the variables from there and some of the variables from some other locations, and it combines all of that together, and it runs through some scripts that loop over some directories, and it will basically loop over anything. It matches anything that starts out with VM Linux dash, and it makes a big list of these. Then it loops over the list, and I believe it like reverses the list, and then whichever one comes first is the one that's the default first entry in grub, and that's how it generates those menus. It's a big convoluted system, but it's basically sorting the entries and doing them in a specific order like that. So there you go. And apparently, I think it's supposed to be alphabetical order, but I believe numbers are coming before, or rather letters are coming before numbers. Any case, this is the order it picked was when I have all three of these kernels and I update grub, it does this one first, then this one, the newest numbered version, and then this one. And when you update, so if you update the kernel with Pac-Man, it will install this. And then if you, it's supposed to update grub, but apparently it didn't. And I think it didn't because it knew the package was already there. So the hook that tells it to, or the trigger that tells it to update grub said, hey, it's already installed. You don't need to do that. We're just going to reinstall the package in case something was corrupted, but apparently it doesn't update grub. It's supposed to though. Or it may be that since it always overwrites over this one file here, it doesn't need to update grub because it works on the assumption that that may be the case too. It works on the assumption that grub is always going to point to this. That may be its behavior. That's not how it's supposed to behave, but that might be what it's doing. One way or another, don't trust it. If you ever want to make sure grub adds whatever entries it's supposed to add, just update grub manually. Just run the grub update, grub mkconfig command manually, and rename the files and verify that it did what it's supposed to. Or you could just edit that file yourself and make sure nothing else generates the grub config, because you don't want grub mkconfig to overwrite your manually edited config file. So there you go. When you basically, the takeaway here is when you compile a custom kernel, you might have to do a few things to make sure it's the default entry in grub. And, when you update the kernel using pacman after that, you got to pay attention to what you're doing, and that's it. So anyways, this is more than I expected it to do. Yeah, a little bit more involved than I thought it would be. Messing around with grub, I guess, turns out to be more involved than poking around with the actual settings inside the kernel configuration. But there you have it. We've compiled and updated our kernel for Arch Linux. So hopefully you found this useful or interesting. Might want to give me a thumbs up. Leave a comment down below if I missed anything or anything else you want to say. Just leave a comment. And you might want to hit that subscribe button and hit the little bell icon so you don't miss out on our other great tech content. We're doing more Arch Linux stuff, more Linux kernel stuff, more Linux stuff in general. We also do other OSs, Mac OS, Windows, all that kind of stuff. We just try, we're tech in general. So we do hardware, software, electronics, Raspberry Pis, 3D printing, just lots of tech stuff. So if you're into that, you want it on your YouTube feed, make sure you hit that subscribe button. And that is it for today. So as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys on that next video.